Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. This week's report is part 2 of examining and looking at the family background, history, political views, and worldview of Israel's chief negotiator in the peace process, Tzipi Livni. So now, part 2. By the time Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat had their famous handshake on the White House lawn in 1993, Livni had begun to move toward the political center. And working as a high-powered attorney at the time, she thought that the Oslo Accords to be poorly constructed. But she had also come to believe that Israel could not forever rule over a hostile population, particularly a fast-expanding one that, combined with Israel's own Arab minority, threatened to one day make Jews a minority in Israeli-held territory. Livni said she decided to enter politics on Yom Kippur in 1995, a few weeks before Rabin was assassinated in November. Livni narrowly missed getting into the Knesset in the 1996 elections, but shortly thereafter she received a call from Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's recently deposed foreign minister, who at the time was Benjamin Netanyahu's chief of staff, sharing with her an interesting opportunity. Netanyahu was planning to privatize several government-owned entities and was looking for someone to oversee the program as general manager of the government company's authority. Livni accepted the job. Asked whether Netanyahu was a mentor to her during that period, she said that her interaction with Netanyahu was mostly confined, with both of them posing for pictures and a big check. I'm not a person of mentors. The only mentor I can speak of as such was Jabotinsky, who died in 1940, Livni said. I'm still quoting his views. In the 1999 elections, Livni finally won a place in the Knesset, but Netanyahu lost the premiership to Labor's Ehud Barak, who had campaigned on ending the conflict with the Palestinians. Netanyahu was replaced at Likud's helm by Ariel Sharon, a hardline former general who promptly took Livni under his wing. Condoleezza Rice, at the time a foreign policy advisor to then-Governor George Bush, recalls visiting Israel that year and meeting Livni for the first time. It was a very hot day and we were on the 3rd floor of the building, Rice remembers. Sharon, as he often did, pulled out all of his maps to show us Israel's security dilemma. He said, "Now I want you to meet this young colleague of mine." It was Tzipi, and he said, "You two women will do some good things for the world someday." We always took that as a kind of a compliment. When Sharon was elected prime minister 2 years later, following the failure of Ehud Barak's peace offer at Camp David and the launch of the second Intifada by the Palestinians, Livni became a minister in the new Likud government, serving in a variety of portfolios over the coming years: agriculture, regional cooperation, immigrant absorption, housing, and then justice. Israel in those years were engaged in an all-out war with Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups, a war whose high civilian casualties frequently left the government having to explain itself to the international community. Even as a junior minister, Livni became one of the country's most effective diplomats. I think, frankly, that the fact that she was a woman who was taking these hardline positions helped Sharon with Condoleezza Rice and President Bush, said Elliot Abrams, a senior Bush official. According to Abrams, Livni almost single-handedly convinced Bush, Rice, and other senior U.S. officials to support the controversial barrier Israel was building to keep out suicide bombers. Before Livni's lobbying, Bush had said that it would be very difficult to develop confidence between the Palestinians and Israel with a wall snaking through the West Bank. Later, Abrams recalls she persuaded Bush to come out foursquare against the right of return for Palestinian refugees, a position endorsed in Bush's famous letter of assurances to Sharon that Israel still quotes today. Israel's initial response to the Second Intifada had been a lurch to the right. But as the country began to gain the upper hand against terrorism, Sharon and other right-wingers in the government started to come around to Livni's view that Israel had no choice but to separate from the Palestinians, even if it meant giving up land. Sharon endorsed the two-state solution and in 2005 unilaterally withdrew all settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip. The pullout split the Likud between moderate ministers like Livni and more hardline elements like Netanyahu. Eventually, Sharon, facing a leadership challenge from Netanyahu, left Likud and started a new centrist party, Kadima, taking with him Livni and other Likud moderates, as well as some centrist labor members. Sharon had a stroke months before the election, but when his deputy prime minister Ehud Olmert led Kadima to victory in the Israeli elections, Livni was promoted to foreign minister, where she quickly became a favorite of the international community. When Livni was replaced by hardliner Avigdor Lieberman in 2009, French President Nicolas Sarkozy was reported to have begged Netanyahu to bring her back. And when peace talks with the Palestinians resumed at the end of 2011, Livni was named chief negotiator. The death of Arafat in 2004, whom Livni and most Israelis believed was not serious about ending the Israel-Palestinian conflict, had convinced her that peace was now possible. Arafat's replacement, Mahmoud Abbas, had been the leading Palestinian voice for peace with Israel and now seemed intent on striking a peace deal. As the negotiations began, Livni became friendly with Saeb Erekat and other Palestinian officials. Said former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice under the Bush administration, "The interactions that I saw, and I was in a lot of discussions with Erekat and Livni, is that they were tough negotiations, but they were negotiations in good faith. I thought everyone was doing their best." As Livni returns to the negotiating table, she faces no shortage of skeptics who doubt that this round of talks will succeed and hardliners who hope that it will not. "We are marking 20 years from Oslo this coming September, and we've seen a lot of photo ops and a lot of meetings," said Israeli Deputy Defense Minister and Likud Central Committee Chair Danny Danon, who argues that Livni's two-state vision is dead on arrival. "I think it will fail either in the negotiations, as it did in the past, when Prime Ministers Barak and Olmert offered a peace deal to the Palestinians and they refused to accept it, or it will fail when the Israeli public will not support it." Most Israelis, meanwhile, have long since moved on from the conflict with the Palestinians. Livni recalled meeting some of the leaders of the left-wing, youth-driven economic protests that shook Israel in the summer of 2011 and encouraged them to speak out for peace as well. They said, "Peace is old stuff," she remembered. Livni welcomed the pessimism. "From a pragmatic point of view, when we created great hopes and nothing came of it, it led to violence," she said. "So this situation in which we're entering the negotiating room and there are not high expectations, that's okay. All I wanted was just a chance to be there and to negotiate with the Palestinians." Most of Israeli skepticism stems from the failure of the 2008 talks, which culminated with Abbas walking away from a far-reaching peace proposal made by then Israel Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. But Livni argues that the situation was more complicated than the way it's viewed in Israel, as being just another Palestinian leader missing yet another historic opportunity. The talks that Livni led succeeded in narrowing the gaps between the sides considerably and had even led to understandings on some issues. They were making a lot of progress at the time, Condoleezza Rice remembers. According to American and Palestinian officials involved at the time, Abbas and other Palestinian leaders balked at Olmert's offer, not necessarily because they rejected the terms, though certainly they hoped for a better offer, but it was more so because they feared that Olmert, who had already announced his intention to resign, couldn't deliver on his peace offer. "We were not certain how much validity anything could be reached with Olmert having to leave his office," said Ma'en Arikat, the chief Palestinian representative to the United States. At that time, he was considered to be a lame duck. Instead, they hoped to secure a deal with Livni, whom they mistakenly calculated would win the 2009 elections. Today, Livni is critical of the way Olmert handled the talks. "After 8 months, and it was November 2008, we met all together," Livni said. "I was there, Mahmoud Abbas was there, the Arab League was there, the quartet, all the ministers, and we all agreed that it's going okay. Abbas and I basically made the same speeches, saying the process was working, that we both needed more time, that we had built trust between each other and we agreed on some issues, and we don't want the world to be involved in this, that instead we need to do it by ourselves on a bilateral process. And this was our mutual message. This was the reality for me. And then I discovered that one day Olmert gave Abbas a map for a potential peace agreement, saying to him, 'You need to sign here, and you need to sign there, because this is a unique opportunity. Take it or leave it.' The idea of Ehud Barak or Olmert putting something on the table and saying, 'Here it is, take it or leave it, you need to decide,' this is not, in my view, the way that we should negotiate." 5 years later, the success of new negotiations will likely hinge on the ability of Netanyahu and the Palestinian leadership to overcome their mutual suspicion suspicion, and it may fall into the hands of Livni, who has the trust of both sides to bridge the differences. Mahmoud Abbas and his people, she says, people say that they're not willing to end the conflict. I know that they are willing to do so, but they're willing to do so only if they get what they want. And based upon reports, leaks, and public statements, what the Palestinian leadership want and what they are willing to give for it is fairly clear. Should there be an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, the Palestinian leadership wants a Palestinian state on the equivalent of 100% of the West Bank and the Gaza, with modest land swaps to accommodate some Israeli settlements, the dividing of Jerusalem along ethnic lines, with East Jerusalem the capital of a Palestinian state, and an international regime that will oversee the old city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, as well as strong demilitarization provisions for the new state and a large-scale compensation and resettlement for the descendants of Palestinian refugees. On the Israeli side, meanwhile, the situation is basically reversed. With these right-wing credentials, Netanyahu stands uniquely positioned to sell a deal to an Israeli public that most polls show is primed to support one. But whether he is prepared to make the necessary compromises is less clear, and to many Palestinians, doubtful. I know very well that Livni as a person wants peace, senior Palestinian official Nabil Sha'ath told the Associated Press in February, but at the end, the decision is not hers. The decision is up to Netanyahu in his inner security cabinet. The prospects for peace may rest then on whether Livni can persuade Netanyahu to accept the terms that most everyone agrees are likely. While Livni did not feel free to talk about the core issues of the current peace talks, she was asked instead whether Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was willing to pay the political price for a peace agreement with the Palestinians. In the past, she had said that Netanyahu did not. However, this time, she said, I believe that we are entering serious negotiations in order to end the conflict with the Palestinians. Everyone who enters the negotiating room, whether they be on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, knows basically in general terms what's going to be the political price that needs to be paid in order to get a peace agreement. Her answer sounded like she thought that Netanyahu was willing to be flexible. As evidence, Livni pointed to the Israeli government's recent release of Palestinian prisoners who had been held mostly on murder charges since before the 1993 Oslo Accords, which was intended as a confidence-building measure for the restart of direct peace talks. If at the beginning of all these discussions, if you would have asked somebody whether Netanyahu is willing to release the pre-Oslo prisoners, she said the answer I would have given would have been no. However, when Netanyahu made the decision, it was clear he was going to pay a political price, particularly among his own political base. However, it wasn't the first time Netanyahu had enraged the political right. His appointment of Livni had done that months earlier. For the time being, this team of rivals seems to be working well with each other. She's in and out of the office very regularly, says a Netanyahu advisor, estimating that if Livni isn't the minister to have the most personal time with Netanyahu, she's definitely at the top of the list. He's very glad that she's in the government, said an Israeli official. Their relationship works well because it's clear one of them is prime minister and the other, that is Tzipi Livni, is justice minister. Livni too seems at peace with the new reality. Netanyahu and I are working together, hours and hours of discussions about what is the next best step. He truly understands that we need to break the stalemate. When asked about Netanyahu's family background compared to hers, she said, I can only speak for myself, but that the two-state solution for her was not throwing away the value of her parents, but reconciling them, balancing their territorial ambitions with their hopes for a Jewish democratic state. She went on to explain that when I make decisions, I'm not thinking about my parents. Instead, I'm thinking about the future of my children and my grandchildren. So Tzipi Livni is a believer that it's possible to have a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Will she succeed? In the end, will Netanyahu agree with her political perspectives? In the end, only time will tell. But in order to get an insight where perhaps the peace process is going, it's always good to have an understanding of the background of the people who are doing the negotiating. Until we do it again, Shalom. In Yeshua the Messiah, Amen.